Namaste and greetings. I, Aswash Mahanta, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to all of you to IMPRI Web Policy Learning. Today we are gathered here for day 2 of an online international winter school program 2023, a 3-day immersive online certificate training course on feminism, fundamentals, facets, and future. This training program is organized by IMPRI Gender Impact Studies Center, GISC, New Delhi. I welcome all of you to this enlightening deliberation and thank you for putting your time, energy, and efforts to truly understand the issues concerning the fundamentals and the various facets of feminism, thus helping us to bring together the practitioners, scholars, and participants for impactful policy research and action. This session will be chaired by Professor VIBHUTI Patel,
Hello.
Visiting Distinguished Professor at IMPRI. Our convener is Dr. Simi Mehta, CEO and Editorial Director at IMPRI. This 3 days training program has an excellent panel who will be sharing their knowledge on the above theme. The panel includes Dr. Leena Pujari, Professor Roxana Marinescu, Professor Manisha Desai, Dr. Vahida Nanar, Professor VIBHUTI Patel, Professor Somya Uma, Professor Linda Lane, and Professor Vijayalakshmi Nanda. Before we start today's session, I would like to announce the housekeeping rules once again. Please join the meeting on time. There will be a question and answer session after each presentation. Share your questions on the Q&A box and not on the chat box. The questions must not be posted as an anonymous attendee. Ensure that your questions are precise. Refrain from making general comments in the question to save time. Now, without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor VIBHUTI Patel to start off the session with her opening remarks. We look forward to learning from our esteemed gathering. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
So, good evening, friends. First of all, I would like to thank the IMPRI team and Dr. Arjun Kumar, Simi Mehta for this hard work. And yesterday we had a very fruitful day. I greet Dr. Vaida Nayanar, Dr. Manisha Desai, and I also see Dr. Leena Pujari, who kickstarted the course. Yesterday's session, we had a very interesting discussion where Dr. Leena Pujari delineated the genesis of feminism, and in her lecture on feminism and genesis trajectory, which she talked about with a very powerful presentation. It was an awe-inspiring examples she gave from varied historical and geographical contexts in a very lucid and engaging style. She quoted Bell Hooks, Sarah Ahmed, Professor Nivedita Menon's work, where she talked about the question of, she also unpacked the whole concept of gender equality. And she said that the various ways in which feminists have responded to this term. And she gave so many historical examples, right from that of Greek civilization to the present, and also the Renaissance, the debate that Renaissance. She also told about the witch hunting that feminists had to face throughout the history, and it is not in the, say, 19th century that feminist upsurges took place. Individually, so many women who had challenged the patriarchal control over their lives. And she also talked about many, how we need to, how feminists challenge sexism in science, in social science, in politics, and in various walks of life. The question and answer session was extremely lively, and we also were participants seriously engaged and she asked so many questions, and Dr. Leena Pujari answered them also beautifully. Professor Roxana Marinescu's lecture on aspects of contemporary feminism that complemented what Dr. Leena Pujari had said, and also extended the argument from the contemporary feminist discourses. Both of them emphasized the importance of intersectionality. And Professor Roxana said that the feminist agenda is mainly focused around access to resources, safety of life, and also the representation in the decision-making bodies. And she also cautioned the participants about some of the illiberal forces and authoritarian and conservative forces. She also gave the manifesto of feminism for 99%, which was released in European Union in 2019. She specifically gave examples of East European countries, and she also classified contemporary feminism into transnational business feminism, market feminism, and also handmaiden of capitalism, and also feminism in neoliberalism. She also quoted Nancy Fraser's 2013 publication, which had many repercussions. And she told the participants about that how the imposter syndrome which is found more frequently in women, that as Susan Faludi had averred, and we need to avoid that. She also talked about the bell hooks of Fox feminists. And she also told us about the parity also that we need, and also the various ideological trends which are there in the East European and Northern European and East European countries. She gave a comparative analysis of European Union, and she said the wide range of indicators that she gave, quantitative data about the decision-making, about women's economic participation, gender parity index. And she said that how the white feminists have divided the world into second world feminism and third world feminism. And she says that they are the ones who try to impose their agenda. And this top-down bubble has to burst, and we need to have a bottom-up initiative. And the new conservative onslaught on feminism, by bringing the discourse on family first, and also the obsession about children, violation of reproductive rights of women, and excommunication and ostracization of LGBTQIA community, that needs to be challenged by the collective feminist this thing. Even the Roma minority rights, they need to be asserted by the feminists. So she also talked about the gender rights in academia, and also they are also feminists, how they are facing backlash in the academia, where the budgetary allocation for Women's Studies Center has been completely wiped out. So some countries like Hungary and Poland and all, they have removed women's studies and gender studies. You can't even use the word gender. So that is the kind of backlash that we are facing. On the whole, that yesterday's this was extremely engaging, very, very, it raised so many important concerns. And today, now we are going to have a very important discussions on feminism and sexual violence law reforms by Dr. Vaidya Nayanar. Dr. Manisha Desai will enlighten us about feminist reflexivity and decolonial and intersectional feminism. And after that, the last presentation will be by me on fundamentals of feminist theory and praxis in India. Thank you very much. And Avash, you take over this. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We will now start off today's session, and it will be conducted by Dr. Vaidya Nayanar, who will be presenting on feminism and sexual violence law reform. Dr. Nayanar is an independent researcher and a gender consultant. We are indeed very honored to have you with us, ma'am. Over to you. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will begin by sharing my screen. Just a moment. Is the screen full?
No, it is in working mode. You have to make it in a slideshow.
Okay. Just a moment. I don't see the play button. Just 1 second.
Yeah, we also don't see it.
Yeah. There. Okay.
It's okay. It's legible because your font size is large. Now it's fine.
Yes,
You can see full
it
screen.
is fine, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So thank you very much. I thank IMPRI and Professor Vibhuti Patel and the Gender Impact Study Center for inviting me here as a resource person on this online international winter school program on this important topic of feminism, fundamental facets and future. Today, as they have mentioned, the topic of my talk will be feminism and sexual violence law reform. And within this topic, I shall be talking about 4 or 5 broad aspects. One is the beginning of law reform on sexual violence here in India. What has been the laws on sexual violence and experiences of women of sexual violence on the ground and the gap between it. I will talk about the Verma Committee of 2013 and the law reform initiated by this committee and the advocacy that feminists have done in that, the new legislations that followed the recommendations from this committee, general debates on punishments for sexual violence law reform, the implications that have come about as a result of the law reform that have taken place since 2013, and generally the continuing challenges that exist on
Dr.
reform.
Vaida Naina, we are not able to see your PPT. Your screen is not visible.
Was my screen visible earlier?
No, this thing was also still. When you were speaking also,
Is it now
we could hear
visible?
your voice. Voice we could hear, yeah.
No, is the PPT visible?
No, PPT is not visible.
Okay, I don't know.
Don't make it full screen. Don't make it full screen because maybe that is the reason it is taking.
All right, let me get my.
Sometimes it happens.
Please try sharing again, yes.
Okay, I'm trying to get my screen over here.
Bandwidth is low. Your bandwidth is low.
That could be the possible.
Yeah, so just you can email your PPT to.
No, it's okay. Is this visible now?
Yeah, this is fine. So now don't make it full screen.
So I will not make it full screen.
No, otherwise it will need more bandwidth. Yeah.
Correct. Okay. All right. So generally, these are the 4 broad topics that I would be talking about. And so without much further ado, the beginning was what is called the Mathura case. Laws on sexual violence remained for the longest time as written in the Indian Penal Code, which India inherited from the British in 1816. The first debates for the need for law reform came over a century later in 1979, following the Supreme Court judgment in the case of State of Maharashtra versus Tukaram, or popularly known as the Mathura rape case. In this incident, the trial court acquitted 4 policemen on the charge of custodial rape of a 16-year-old tribal girl. The court found no physical evidence that the girl resisted the rape and concluded, therefore, that she must have consented. The Bombay High Court overturned the acquittal and viewed that since the accused were perfect strangers to Mathura, it was highly unlikely that she would make any overtures or invite the accused to satisfy her sexual desire. This is in quotes. The High Court came to the conclusion that the policeman had taken advantage of the fact that Mathura was alone in the dead hour of the night in the police station. This proved that she could not in any probability have consented to the intercourse. The Supreme Court overturned the High Court conviction on the ground that as there was no injuries shown by the medical report, the story of her having put stiff resistance was false, and therefore the alleged intercourse was a peaceful affair or that she consented. Now, this was the Supreme Court overturning the conviction of the Bombay High Court. Following this court judgment, it raised a huge hue and cry and caused a lot of protest among the women's groups and women generally in the country. And 4 prominent legal academics were Sudha Dhagambar, Lotika Sarkar, Raghunath Kelkar, and Upendra Bagsi, wrote an open letter to the Chief Justice of India and raised, among other issues, issues of gender stereotype resorted by the Supreme Court to overturn the conviction of policemen by the Bombay High Court. They pointed out several issues. One as to why did the court felt that the factors which weighed favorably by the High Court was insufficient to justify the rape. they believe that Mathura would have taken the initiative for intercourse, a 16-year-old tribal girl. Why was she asked to remain in police station when her friends and relatives were asked to leave? And why does the court expect a young girl who was trapped by 2 policemen inside a police station in the dead of night to successfully raise alarm for help? And do they seriously expect a girl, a laborer, to put up such stiff resistance so that against a well-built policeman to have physical marks of injuries? So all these important questions were raised by these academics. The case led to a series of campaigns and protests from women, and several women's groups were formed around the activism of this case, which then went on to engage with feminist legal reform, particularly reform on law reform on rape. And feminism on the question of ensuring prosecution of rape and ending impunity of rape prosecution. So as I mentioned, several women's groups were formed around the activism in this case, and it's the beginning of what is known as the feminist movement or the autonomous women's movement here in India, following the Mathura rape case. Not the women's
Veda, we have lost you. Dr. Vaida, we have lost you.
Sorry, I got disconnected again. I think my connection is not all that good. Yeah. So
you can keep your video off, then it would work better.
All right, I think that's a better idea.
Yeah.
Okay. So in 1983, following the Mathura rape case, the first amendment was introduced, which said, among other things, that if the victim says that she did not consent, then the court will presume that as a fact and proceed with the case. The second major change that that was introduced was that custodial rape was punishable. Not only that, but the burden of proof was shifted from the victim to the offender, which of course means that generally in the law, the accused is considered innocent until proven guilty. But if it is a case of custodial rape or sexual violence, then it is the burden of proof is on the accused to prove that the accusation against him is wrong and that he is innocent. So that was a major shift and law reform that happened following the Mathura rape case. And this case led to greater awareness of women's legal rights, issues, oppressions, and patriarchal mindset, and therefore is considered one of the turning point in the feminist movement in India. And in the course of these feminist engagement in rape laws subsequent to the Mathura rape case, feminists identified what the gaps were with regard to the existing laws on sexual violence in the IPC, and what were the actual and the gap that exists between the actual experiences of women on the ground with on sexual violence themselves and the subsequent problems with the access to justice. And these generally were identified as a problem. First one was that rape law was only the laws on rape in Indian Penal Code only recognize penile penetration of the vagina. Women were victims of other violations like insertion of weapons and objects into genitalia or insertion of penis into the mouth or forced oral sex. But these other acts could not be considered rape as per the law. So if they are not considered rape within the definition, how else can these be accounted for or prosecuted in the Indian Penal Code? Then the other provisions under which these violations could be prosecuted was what was called outraging the modesty of women, with a maximum of 2 years imprisonment. Now, there are two issues with this particular provision of outraging money. One is the language. In the language, rape was not considered a serious assault on the woman's body, but on her modesty, thereby prioritizing women's modesty, chastity over the personhood or the body of the woman. Two, other assaults by weapons is considered grievous assault and attracts greater punishment, but not sexual assault, because injury by bottles and sticks and rods and other objects did not amount to rape as per the existing definition there. Further, the groups that were working on this reform found that there were several stereotypes and misconceptions regarding sexual violence that informed the immediate medical examinations following the rape. The doctors looked for injuries to establish lack of consent. And if they did not find injuries, they concluded in their report that therefore rape did not occur. The fact that the survivor may have been unable to resist because of threats or the use of restraints or intoxicant was not taken into consideration at all. So there you have the serious stereotypes that enters into the process of rape investigation and prosecution. Even in the prosecution of the penal vaginal rape, as per the definition of law, the judicial discretion often passed sentences of less than 7 years based on matters such as victims' past sexual history, acquaintance with the perpetrator, marital status, socioeconomic status, and so on. This despite the fact that Indian evidence law clearly says that the past sexual history of the survivor is irrelevant to cases of sexual violence. And yet these parameters find their way in medical examination pro formas and in trials, and also these kind of findings are used by courts in court judgment to pronounce the survivor as somehow promiscuous and having either invited the intercourse or having consented to it. So if the victim shows that she has a past sexual history, then she is supposed to be promiscuous and therefore consented to the assault. Or if she's somehow if she's marital status, it is regarded that she's used to sexual intercourse, and therefore the assault could not be considered that grievous, and so on. These kind of gender stereotypes and ideas based on modesty, chastity find their way into the law reform, and there is an effort to character assassinate the victim, and find either acquit the accused or pass a reduced sentences on the accused. So this was the existing situation with regard to laws then and the experiences of women. Then we have 3 decades later. For 3 decades, there was no reform on the laws for sexual violence. Although women's group continued to advocate for state with law reforms, generally feminist and women's group are skeptical of any kind of state initiated or state supported reforms. And one of the major advocacy movement for feminist and women's movement or law reform for sexual violence was with the Justice Verma Committee that was established following the public outcry on the rape of Jyoti Singh in December 2012. As we all know, this was the case of Jyoti Singh rape, or otherwise known as the Nirbhaya rape in December 2012, where a young woman was brutally raped by 4 men in public transport bus, as a result of which she passed away from her grievous and brutal injuries that she sustained. Now, government did not expect the kind of public outcry and campaigns and protests that were held. These campaigns and protests were not only by women's groups, but also by general public. And not only, and these protests went on for days on end, and there was this demand for death penalty to the rapist, and all such kinds of demands were made. And government was forced to act expeditiously, and one of their responses was to form a committee to look into the matter and recommend changes in law reform to the government. And that's how the Justice Verma Committee was formed. The committee solicited public opinions and suggestions on reform of laws on sexual violence. This gave the feminist groups an opportunity to suggest amendments based on the experience gathered from decades of work on women's issues with women survivors of sexual violence. 24 organizations made submissions to the Verma Committee, 15 of whom were feminist groups and individuals. The suggestions and recommendations made to the committee fall in 5 broad categories. One was changes in the language and vocabulary. The groups suggested change approach towards sexual violence in the language and vocabulary. Feminists rejected terms like rape, ravishment, outraging women's modesty that was inherited from British colonial concept of virginity, honor, chastity, and modesty. They also rejected the view of rape as a loss of honor and fate worse than death, or that the greatest danger for women is the lurking stranger as after nightfall. Instead, feminists suggested the term of sexual assault to recognize that sexual violence is an attack on the bodily integrity and sexual autonomy of the women. So that was one broad change suggested. Next was the expansion in the definition of rape to existing definition of rape to include non-penile penetration of objects, not only in vagina, but in anus and in mouth, in addition to the vagina. Also included was non-consensus oral sex. All these, so the definition of rape expanded not only to penile vagina penetration, but to penetration of objects in anus or in the mouth or non-consensual oral sex. This was in recognition that the offense of sexual violence, sexual assault, has got more to do with violence and the assault and less to do with sex, which means that it is less motivated by lust or sex and more an exercise of power by men over women. So the third category of suggestions were the recognition of other conducts of sexual assault. In addition to rape, the groups suggested recognition of a range of acts like groping, pinching, flashing, stalking, blackmailing, violating electronic media as sexual assault, and suggested that these assaults be graded by varying degree and kind based on the harm that they cause women. And the next was the scope of aggravated sexual assault was also introduced, by which meant that sexual assault by state machinery or state officials, which include police, paramilitary, armed forces, and any other government forces, when they are accused as perpetrators, these should be considered as aggravated sexual assault, and to remove the impunity of state official and eliminate the need for sanction of prosecuting state official or state official perpetrator who has been accused of sexual assault. So that was the scope of aggravated sexual assault. And finally, the submission was made on understanding the concept of consent. The suggested changes in understanding consent, which says that there should be no presumption of consent based on women's sexual history, character, lack of physical resistance, and so on, which meant that consent would be unequivocal willingness to engage in sexual acts, regardless of other extraneous consideration like her relationship with the perpetrator or silence on the matter, or decide on the degree of consent and the extent to which the consent meant consent and so on. So therefore, the consent standard was suggested to be closer to an affirmative consent standard. Following all these suggestions made, of course, after the Justice Verma concluded their work in 3 months and made several recommendations. Some of the recommendations that the women's group made were also found its way in the acts that were passed after 2013. So the rape laws that was not amended for 30 years, then a slew of punitive legislations were introduced in response to sexual violence, which was a relatively new development following the 2012 rape case. Among the biggest amendment was, of course, the Criminal Amendment Act of 2013 and subsequently of 2018, which introduced stringent punishments. So among the changes that were made in 2013 was that the suggestion that the definition of rape be expanded was accepted, and accordingly, all forms of rape was included and recognized as rape. Punishment was gang rape was identified as 20 years, was extended to life, and life was clarified as a natural life of the accused and not just 20 years. Then there was a rigorous punishment of not less than 20 years or imprisonment of life or death if the rape led to the death of the woman or if the woman is left in a vegetative state. And the other important amendment that was made was the existing judicial discretion that was included in the IPC that allowed the courts to reduce sentences based on facts of the case. That discretion was completely removed. And of course, it expanded the notion of sexual assault to include voyeurism, disrobing women, stalking, voluntarily throwing acid. All of these acts were made punishable under various sections. Similarly, there was the POCSO Act was also amended in 2019, and which enhanced the mandatory minimum punishment for sexual crimes against children. State governments have also introduced amendments, and for example, the Andhra Pradesh Legislative Assembly introduced death penalty for rape in response to the rape and murder in Hyderabad in December 2019. So all these the actions, the measures that the state take is more stringent punishment and more stringent measures with regard to enhanced punishment was introduced as a way to deal with offenses of sexual violence. Now we will go on to talk about the general debates on punishment that were happening around the submission of submissions to the Verma Committee and the subsequent ones that got into the acts and amendments in law reform. During the submissions of Verma Committee, feminist groups generally had the approach that they were against death penalty and against a carceral approach to dealing with sexual violence, accountability. And when we mean carceral approach is more imprisonment, responding to such violence with a harsher punishment, more imprisonment, and enhancing the life, the number of years of imprisonment or death penalty. Almost all the feminist group that made submissions were very clearly against death penalty. This went against the grain of the popular demand then by the general public and other organizations to impose death penalty to rapists. And feminist group was firmly against this demand for death penalty. And there were several reasons forwarded for it. One is that it's a cruel punishment that cannot be taken back. And that gives way to new cultures of violence and allows for state-sanctioned killing. And feminist group recognized that there was a need to check the power of the state to kill its own citizen, given what the experiences that women's group have with the state using laws like AFSPA in conflict region to kill with impunity. And therefore, one major skepticism among feminist group to give more power to state was to check this power. Then the second was the failure of criminal justice system generally with harsher punishment. The harsh punishment has been shown to decline the conviction rate because judges are generally reluctant to impose stricter penalties, particularly penalties of life and death sentences. So if you have death sentences as a punishment for a crime, it is more likely that the conviction rate falls than raise. Plus, there was also concern that perpetrators will be more inclined to kill the victim and leave no evidence if the punishment is the same for example, murder and sexual assault. So those were the aspects of criminal justice system that women's group had experience of and advanced those arguments against death penalty and harsh punishment. Second, the other aspect debates on punishment also talks about the general socio-cultural and gender impact of harsher punishment or death penalty. The groups recognized and submitted that most of such harsh punishments are generally imposed on marginalized communities of the societies. So when these harsher punishments are available, it is most likely imposed on the poor, the lower caste, the minorities, the tribal communities, and other marginalized sections. Besides, there is no evidence of these harsh punishment having any kind of deterrent effect. Plus, when the perpetrators are known to women, harsher punishment like death can lead or not only to fall in conviction rate, but fall in the crime report rate, as women would be reluctant to place the threat of death on people they know or are acquainted with. Also, death sentences, reinforce the patriarchal view of rape as a fate worse than death or loss of honor, which the feminists have outrightly rejected. This is not rejecting this patriarchal view of and worldview of rape as fate worse than death. And finally, one big is also the use of death to harsher punishment. The response of state always with regard to addressing sexual violence or assault is with harsher punishment is an easy way out for the state and distract from the real issues and address measures to prevent crimes or strengthen mechanism of prosecution, police accountability, and trial process, and eliminate the gender biases. Those are more, the measures that would be more effective and rather than responding with harsher punishment. Then what is called the LWRP, or life without remission and parole. One of the demands, actually eight groups that made submission to the commission suggested and demanded life without remission or parole for aggravated rape, which to recall is rape in custody during conflicts or by persons in power and authority. Now, here is also something. This particular life sentence without remission on parole is based on also on the view that no reform is possible for the perpetrator of aggravated sexual violence. There has been a critique about this demand that if anybody who is against death penalty, how can they propose this kind of punishment for even if it is aggravated sexual assault? Because all the arguments that have been used to be against death penalty can be used against having a punishment as harsh as life without remission or parole, because it goes against the reformation and rehabilitation objective of imprisonment itself of the criminal justice system. And therefore it is, this cannot be the basis of just society. This particular suggestion seemed to be informed by feminist frustration of states' unwillingness to prosecute powerful men accused of sexual violence, both within its rank and file as its own officials, if armed forces, or powerful non-state actors as well. And the other last point on the debate on punishment is sexual violence as a continuum and gradation of this continuum. For offenses that do not amount to rape, feminists argued against specific years of imprisonment for it. Instead, they argued for grading of sexual violence on a continuum scale based on the varying degree of harm, humiliation, and degradation caused. And this suggestion was the underlying assumption that not all sexual assault necessarily inflict the same type of harm. So punishment should therefore be scaled up or down depending on the degree and extent of the harm. So these were the broad debates around the around the punishment debate, generally speaking. Then we have the implications of law reform. The implication was these law reform, as it showed, was that despite the approach that feminist groups had of being against death penalty, or approach that did not support generally a carceral approach, what eventually happened with regard to their own suggestions and how the sexual criminal amendment law was passed, and the punishments that was prescribed in that law and how it is taken effect, they did not necessarily engage in the discourse on the punishment for sexual assault with regard to what other kinds of punishment would be appropriate for sexual assault. So, so eventually the punishments that were enacted in the amendments, that is the minimum punishment of 7 years for rape, or no judicial discretion to reduce sentences, or life without remission and parole, all of it endorses the carceral approach and does not kind of distance itself from carceral approach. So one of the implication is that this particular punishment issue coming out of their own submissions and thing had eventually the effect of endorsing a carceral approach. Then the other major impact of these law reform and the debates was seen in what was called the Mohammad Farooqi case, the impact of minimum punishment of 7 years for the crime of rape. Farooqi's case was a case of non-penal penetration, that is of forced oral sex. He was convicted by the trial court, acquitted by the High Court, and his acquittal was overturned by the Supreme Court. Now, this case split the feminist movement right in the middle, because Farooqi was known and moved in feminist circles. So some feminists raised the concern of at this point, the carceral nature of the punishment that was given to him by the trial court, which was 7 years of imprisonment. Others talked about the need to re-examine the expanding of definition of rape, and viewed that forced oral sex is not necessarily rape, or that the widening of rape definition should not warrant a mandatory minimum punishment. So that was the concerns that then came up following this case. And then there were other feminists who opposed this re-examination and called them out for raising doubts over conviction of Farooqi, because the fact is that he was found guilty of an conduct which amounted to rape as the law existed at the time that this case trial was going on. So though feminists advocated for oral, anal, vaginal, digital rape by objects as rape, now suddenly there were arguments being told that some acts were not rape enough, by implying that some kind of rape is more serious than the other. Or, for example, mouth may be more benign than anus, vaginal penetration by penis, or that sexual violence in a drawing room may be less severe than on the street, or by somebody known to you less severe than by a stranger on the street. So all these kinds of categories were now being discussed in the open. So this was one of the kind of immediate fallout of the rape Farooqi, the criminal amendment law that happened, that was not foreseen at the time that women made their submissions. The other impact was the endorsement of gender stereotypes. So prior to the enactment of the amendment, judges who invoked stereotypes about women would invoke stereotypes about women to reduce sentences. And those judges would not consider all the other kind of non-penal vaginal rape that was included in the act as deserving of 7 years of imprisonment at all. So though the mandatory punishment was intended to eliminate any reduction of sentences based on gender stereotype, the gender stereotype nevertheless crept into this case. And this is one of the shortfalls of the submissions made during the Verma Commission. And because in the way this gender stereotype crept in was that this trial court records, that the survivors stated that she had said no multiple times before during the act. And yet the High Court chose to second guess her testimony and fell back on the stereotypes by saying that by qualifying and making an assessment or passing a judgment on the quality of a consent by saying that a feeble no may mean yes. The Supreme Court refused to interfere in the judgment, and of course, the accused walked free, and the victim ended up being discredited by discredited at the High Court and the Supreme Court. So this was one of the kind of fallout with regard to a thing, and this particular case also showed that there was a rollback on the discourse of consent. Because as we noted earlier, following the Mathura case, there was a clear rule introduced in the Evidence Act that if the victim says that she did not consent, the same would be presumed as a fact and proceeded. Now, this particular case shows how that presumption was overturned. And the feminist attempt to remove the judicial discretion to reduce sentences in rape cases actually backfired. And the shortcomings of the mandatory punishment of 7 years turned out to be harmful unintended consequences of that. Plus, post these, the Nirbhay case, the Justice Verma Committee, or the Criminal Amendment Act and the feminist debates and discussions that happened at various levels by women's groups all around the country. And several researches were conducted, and findings of some of them have relevance to this particular debate and discussion. One is a newspaper investigations were made for a newspaper in Delhi, and they made a little study of rape cases registered in Delhi. And it was found that the largest category of rape cases registered in Delhi were in the category of kidnapping and abduction. In fact, these were almost always invariably against boys in cases of elopement by young couples registered by the parents of the girl, and have therefore not necessarily cases of rape at all. And the second major category was the failure in fulfilling the promise to marry. So these were the two major categories under which rape cases were registered. And this particular, it was not envisaged at the time of expansion of the definition of rape. That suggestions made during the Verma Committee and the law that eventually passed, whether these categories of rape would also fall under that definition, and how do you deal with that? Another study conducted in Mumbai also talked about that high prevalence of cases of incest by fathers or male members of the family in broken families, although it was not known whether the numbers is more numerous than of stranger rape. So again, rape by known persons known to the victim. So these are the kind of other categories of rape that would fall within the definition of rape, and how that was not necessarily considered at the time the submissions were made, and laws were reformed. The continuing challenges comes for the women's group and feminist group to discuss the law reform and to re-examine what has happened with regard to law reform on sexual violence. And it comes from the challenges, some of the challenges that have come, and the studies that have come, the facts that are emerging now, and how to respond to it. Of course, the first one would be a discussion on alternative approaches to accountability for sexual violence, and engaging in a discussion and discourse about punishment, to come up with its own discourse on punishment and carcerality. So failure with proposing an alternative, discourse has caused the state to get away with harsher punishment as the only response to sexual violence. And also the women's groups themselves have had experiences of how the shortcomings of stringent punishment as the only response to sexual violence, and observing that these harsh punishments are in a way, only deflects attention from the investigative and prosecutorial inadequacies in the trying the offense of sexual violence cases, which then may lead to fall in conviction rates. So those are the kinds of discussions that there's need for more discourse on, which is happening at various levels, but it's a continuing conversation. Similarly, conversation on reparation for sexual assault is also something that feminist, there's a need for discourse on that. And there is some already around the Nirbhaya case. And there were several suggestions made, and several compensation funds for sexual violence were established by at the national level and at various state level. But again, the feminist engagement with these processes is limited because these funds are not necessarily functioning for the purpose and the way it is supposed to function. There have been recorded how compensation funds allocated to these compensation funds in various states, the money has been returned without use. So it is not like there has been no cases of sexual violence, but because of lack of processes and other issues, these funds are not necessarily functioning the way it should. So there is more need for engagement on these issues of reparation for sexual violence. And then, of course, the discourse on prevention and protection of sexual violence, which talks about addressing structural issues for prevention and protection of sexual violence, meaning going beyond law reform and going beyond trial processes and harsher punishments and all that, and talk about providing enabling conditions for women's, for example, safe use of public spaces while accessing education, employment, and other public resources. One of the response that immediate response when a case like Jyoti Singh or Nirbhaya comes about is more restraint and more constraint on women, rather than giving creating other kind of measures that will enable women to exercise their right of freedom of movement and choice and all of that. Because hostels, women's hostels in campuses and working women's hostels, administration and parents were okay to impose more curfew and restrictions after the 2012 incidents. But that again absolves the state and administration from other measures like creating more awareness, sensitization about gender equality, or investing in infrastructure of safe public transport or safe public spaces, or having programs and projects for eliminating gender biases and stereotypes, improving and simplifying access to justice processes and mechanisms. So these are the measures that need more attention and ongoing feminist engagements with these processes. And it is not like these are not happening. Many feminist groups are continuing their work on these issues. It's a long process, and it's an ongoing, continuing process. And finally, realizing the principle of equality before law. Now, what one means by this principle of equality before law is the critique that women's group have, the skepticism that women have of state, that most of these laws are disproportionately applicable to marginalized groups in the country. So there is a shortfall in realizing the principle of equality before law. And if one give the example of the Jyoti Singh rape case in 2012, there was this massive outrage, and justifiably so, against the rape of Jyoti Singh case, but it overshadowed the rape of other Dalit girls and women that were happening in the neighboring state of Haryana around the same time. By men of upper caste Jat communities. So the social status of the perpetrator and their victim here was reversed in Haryana. So justice was elusive in Haryana as compared to the swiftness of the process of justice in Delhi, where the social status of the perpetrator and victim was reversed. So these are broadly the kind of continuing challenges that challenges that feminists' engagement with law reform and sexual violence that women's groups have to engage in and continue to engage in. This is broadly the summary of what has happened with regard to law reform and sexual violence. There are a lot of specificities that one could talk about and that are important within these. What I have picked up is only the broad kind of milestone that would thing. And also I'll also mention that there are several women feminist and feminist organizations that have participated in the process. Ones that participated in the Burma Committee, those names are there in the Burma Committee report also. But women's groups from all over the country, not only Mumbai, Delhi, Hyderabad and small other spaces have come together and are responsible for engaging with the law reform process on sexual violence. I think I'll end over here and we can have a discussion and conversation following this.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We are indeed grateful that you have joined, and thank you for providing such an enriching session for all our participants. Now, before moving on to questions, I would like to invite our professor, Chair Professor Patel, to put forward her thoughts on Dr. Naina's presentation. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, I will not take long because we are running late and we have 3 presentations today. Yesterday, we had more liberty to exceed time limit. So first of all, I think Dr. Vaida has come up with an extremely exhaustive presentation and gone into the finer details of the IPC and the jurisprudence. 5 important points which I've been really learnings of the Me Too movement, where so many aggrieved survivors of sexual violence, they had to use the social media platform, and what are its strengths, how do we critically reflect on it. Then the new series of cyber laws that government has come up with because of the cyber stalking and cyber sexual assault, blackmailing that happens. The question of the how identity politics plays when it comes to either use of judicial route or a legislative route. We have seen in case of Bilkish Bano and number of cases over the last 3-4 years. How does it impact the response of the judiciary? And as she said, that Manodharya scheme, we gender economists are continuously fighting for more allocation for funds for the for the compensation of the survivor of violence. But if there is no political willingness or there is no bureaucratic lethargy, then we see that state after states have kept the funds unutilized. In fact, the 1,000 crore rupees every year since 2013, which are allocated for Nirbhaya fund, hardly 4 or 5 states have used, and that to 40 to 60%. So there are several states and union territories who have not made 100% non-utilization of the funds. So I think that, and when she said that Burma Committee report, equally important report is a Saksham report, in which also feminists were involved, and MHRD, Ministry of Human Resource Development, came up with this report, and UGC has made it mandatory for all the universities to debate. And that in the appendix of the Saksham report, there are various methods of gender sensitization and unlearning sexism and the continuous awareness generation that is suggested. Those modules are also very important. Yeah, over to Avash. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. We can move on to questions. We have a few questions, and I think Sanjana ji, I have added you in the main chat. You can please unmute and ask your question.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am, for the presentation. It was like Professor Patel just said, it was an exhaustive presentation on the legal aspect. So I have 2 questions, and they are kind of interrelated. So first is that in the larger debate that is there against incarceration in principle, what are the other possible mechanisms to punish sexual assaults, punish people who have committed a sexual assault? And if there are any, and how effective are the options that are there, and where are they being implemented? That is, if there are any. And the other thing related to this only is that what are your views on punishment as a deterrent, especially in the cases of sexual assaults, violence against women, intimate partner violence? How successful is the whole idea of punishment as a deterrent? Because they're interrelated, so I thought I'll ask them together.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanjana. That's the important question is, if one is talking about carcerality and is opposed to it, what are the other alternatives? The point, personally speaking, I believe that, this is my view, I believe that at this point, we have not come up with any other alternative with regard to addressing the violations in the criminal reform system other than imprisonment. So that is right now the only way one addresses criminal offenses. And that alternative to that does not exist. So to say that something is harsher punishment, you can debate and discuss as to whether it is harsh punishment or whether the number of years you can discuss or how those years must be spent. Those are the areas where there can be discussion and there can be alternatives proposed. How those years should be spent and what number of years. But those engagements are also not happened within the general discussions have not happened within the at least feminist groups in terms of punishment per se and alternatives to punishment or alternatives to imprisonment. As I see right now, there is no alternative to criminal. Once a violation has happened and it goes into the criminal justice system, that is the only route. So the discussion on alternatives has to come from other sources. But what can also happen is more discussion on the other measures to prevent for prevention of sexual violence. That is by way of a more empowerment of women and other kinds of measures that Vibhuti just mentioned that also are happening at various levels. More gender sensitization about issues of sexual violence and advocacy with the state to allocate budgets for making safe spaces for women, public spaces safe for women, and so on and so forth. So in response to this, that is what I would say personally. In imprisonment right now, there is no alternative. Besides, as I mentioned, the objective of imprisonment is reform and rehabilitation, and in any just society, that option should always be there. One cannot foreclose that option. Foreclosing that option is also endorsing of that carcerality approach. So not foreclosing that option, but keeping that option open. That so possibility of rehabilitation reform is should continue to be the objective of imprisonment. So within those parameters, I think also one can talk about what are the alternatives that can be proposed in terms of not only number of years, but the reduction, as some suggestions were made, that there should be a gradation with regard to these various forms of violation and graded on a continuum scale. And depending on the kind of harm that was experienced by women, and punishment can be scaled up or down based on the extent of harm. So those are the broad parameters within which this discussion can proceed. And the second question was, I'm sorry.
There are 5 questions, but I think we have exceeded the time limit. Dr. Manisha Desai is there. So okay. I think, yeah, they can be sent to you by email, and I'll say we can share Dr. Vaida's email with participants and they can communicate with them. Or in a chat box, Vaida, you can answer the questions in the chat box. That is also
okay. Fine. That's also fine. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also fine. You can read the questions, no?
In the Q&A, right?
Yes, yes. Yes, you can answer there. Yeah. So can we move to the second one, Mr. Vash? Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, ma'am. We would like to invite our second expert for today's session, Professor Manisha Desai, who will be speaking on feminist reflexivity and decolonial and intersectional feminism. Professor Desai is the department head, Sociology, Professor of Sociology and Asian American Studies, University of Connecticut, USA. A very warm welcome to you, ma'am, and over to you.
Thank you. Can I share my PowerPoint? Is it possible for you to make me a host?
Just adjust your screen, Professor
Yeah.
Matisha. Yeah, we can see you.
Let me see if I can do that. I'm not able to share it, can I?
Can you send it to IMPRI team?
Yeah, maybe I'll do that, and then I can start talking well.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry about it. Give me
You
just
can
a
try again. You can
Yeah.
try again.
Okay, shares. All right, 1 sec. Let me do that. Where's my PowerPoint? Okay. Yeah, when I click on the share screen, it takes me to not the PowerPoint I have open, but to basic advanced files. Oh, maybe let's see. No, I'm afraid I can't. I will email it
Send
to.
the email.
Yeah, I'll do that. Give me just a second. Sorry about this.
Yeah.
Oops. Okay. I'm sending it to Dr. Kumar. That's the only address I have. Is that
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, I've just sent it, but in the meantime, I can begin talking so we don't get too far behind. I know we're already running a little bit late, and I'll do my best to get us back on track so that we can hopefully have a discussion. So as Dr. Patel mentioned, I was asked to talk on feminist reflexivity and decoloniality. And so I wanted to start by talking about what feminists in general mean by reflexivity, a little bit of its tradition and history of where it comes from. So in a way, reflexivity refers to self-critique via reflection. That is a constant engagement with one's ideas, but particularly in response to one's interlocutors, critical challenges from within the movement, but also outside. So in a way, it's kind of an openness to changing dynamics. And there's a longer history within both social theory and social movements. In reflexivity, it also comes from Marxism, from subaltern theories. And so a lot of different social movements and social theories. And I mentioned both because to me, feminism is both political theory and political praxis, and they each inform each other. And so you see that reflexivity is kind of built into challenges from within feminist movements, but also from outside feminist movements. And therefore, I think it's been a very important part of feminism. And not only is it, and I think what's interesting and important about reflexivity is that that's key to feminisms everywhere. So it's not just feminisms in India or feminisms in the US or feminisms elsewhere, but that's kind of, part and parcel of what it means to be a feminist, is to be open to self-critique and engaging critiques from outside. And so that's kind of what I mean by reflexivity. And, some examples of that is very easy to see feminism as a dynamic theory and praxis. Perfect. Yeah. So will I be able to move to the slides, or can you help me, Mr. Wash?
Yeah, ma'am, you can tell us when to change.
Yeah, so if you can go to the next slide. Yeah, and so this is what, I was defining as feminist reflexivity. self-critique via reflection, openness to changing dynamics, and informed by different theories. But also, most importantly, as I said, it's both international, global, and transnational to decolonial. And you kind of sort of see the shift, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. So the next slide, please. Right. So if you think about feminism, just contemporary feminism, and by contemporary feminism, I mean from the 1960s. And again, 1960s, all over the world, you see, emergence of feminist movements, and they're all in conversation with each other. So to me, the origin of whether feminism is Indian or Western is actually irrelevant, because they do emerge in conversation with each other. So it's not a question of where does it come from. I think it comes from a lot of different places. And all of these feminisms have been in conversation with each other, not just in this iteration, but that was true in the 19th century, that was true in the early 20th century as well. And so if you just think about, some very easy changes in terms of reflexivity within the feminist movement, both in theory and praxis, you can see that in the first sort of wave in the 1960s, feminists really talked about women's liberation. So the subject of feminism was women, that patriarchy was what oppressed all women, and therefore women needed to be liberated, right? Very soon that, understanding of feminism as women's liberation was challenged from a lot of different places. And women of color critique in particular, in the context of the US, talked about, women's liberation was not only about gender oppression, but it was also related to race, for example, in the context of US. In India, in some ways, the critique from caste and class didn't emerge quite as early. And I think partly it was because a lot of the feminist movements of the 70s were focusing already on rural women, on women of a lot of castes. If you think about the Mathura rape case, or if you think about other cases, caste and Adivasi status were already sort of embedded in it. And so you had, even though, autonomous feminism, which was primarily urban, and upper caste or Savarna women were, mostly involved in it, the praxis was informed by rural and poor women and Adivasi women's sexual oppression. So in that sense, the critique from caste and Adivasi women, which I'll talk about a little bit later, comes in India much later, say in the 90s, as opposed to the 80s, with women of color elsewhere. You also then have critique of sexuality from LGBTQI critique, that, women in some ways are not only, oppressed by gender, but also by sexuality, by also their race and class. So that's kind of the definition of intersectionality, that women, are not just women, that women are also in some ways a product of intersecting, social forces. So our identities are multiple, our identities based on gender, caste, race, class, religion, which was very important, as we know, in the case of India, whether, right from Shah Banu's case to ongoing, issues related to Islamic feminisms, right? So that's where you kind of have the emergence of intersectionality. So you already see how within 20 years, feminism, both as theory and praxis, is very dynamic and kind of absorbing and engaging the critiques that come from different places. Then in the 90s, we kind of even move, to gender justice, that when we think about women, we talk about gender, but then also what about men and masculinity? So you have that kind of critique coming up. And so we've sort of moved through from women's liberation to the, critique of sexuality, of race, of class, to gender itself, right? And that kind of was just one example of the ways in which both our theory and our praxis kind of reflects this reflexivity. Next slide, please. And then I want to talk about decoloniality, because I think that's kind of the most current expression of this reflexivity is decoloniality. And what do I mean by decoloniality? Before I talk about that, I want to talk a little bit about post-coloniality, because in some ways, post-coloniality predates decoloniality. And those are kind of both interesting, I think, theoretical interventions within feminism and also within feminist praxis that come in some ways from a couple of different origins. So post-colonial critique of, feminism really emerges from Asian and African feminisms, which were essentially post-colonial societies, right? And the critique of post-coloniality was that even though we had become independent from our colonial masters, a lot of the logic and the grammar of colonial institutions, of colonial knowledge production, and of colonial understanding still pervaded even in post-colonial societies. And we can see that, not only with the dominance of English, but the ways in which, we sort of use categories, secularism, all kinds of sort of colonial categories in sort of new ways, still continue in post-colonial societies. So that was kind of the early critique of post-colonial feminists, primarily from Asia and Africa, including from Asia and India, of course, right? That coloniality did not end with the end of colonialism, right? Coloniality did not end with the end. So post-colonial is not necessarily just a political configuration. So we have, the British did leave, India became independence, and we have Indian leaders, but a lot of post-colonial bureaucracies, legal system, Wahida just talked about, the incarceration, the carceral state that we have, the carceral logic that defines punishment, all of those in some ways continued even post-independence, right? So that was the post-colonial critique. The decolonial critique comes from the Americas, and in some ways it's much more recent than the post-colonial critique was, let's say, from the 80s, 90s. The decolonial critique is much more 90s, 2000s, and contemporary. Decoloniality then kind of shifts a little bit from post-coloniality because it's really about settler coloniality. So settler colonialism is different from colonialism that we experienced in India, because the British then did leave. Settler colonies like the United States, Canada, Australia, and most of the countries in Americas, the colonizers did not leave. So their independence was in some ways a continuation of colonization in a different form. So post-colonial critique then was by countries where the colonizers had left. Decolonial critique is from settler colonialism. That is, the colonizers never left. So as a result, it was very difficult, for example, indigenous communities in all of the Americas, not just North America, but also the South America, to actually kind of claim their own independence, claim their own autonomy, both political, and of course, it's a bit ironic because in the United States, for example, they talk about, right, the American Revolution of 1776, but who was that revolution for? It was for white English people from the English crown, right? It was not for the enslaved Africans. It was not for the indigenous communities that continue in some ways even today to be colonized. They're on reservations. They don't have the same kinds of access to political, social, or economic capital. So then the decolonial critique comes from settler colonial feminisms where the colonizers never left. Post-colonial critique comes from countries like many countries in India and Africa where the colonizers, mainly the French, the British, the Dutch, did leave, though South Africa is kind of a mix because continues to be a settler colony as well. So that's kind of, the decolonial critique that we're talking about today. And what are some of the, examples or new theoretical interventions of these two critiques? And so I want to just give you a couple of examples, and then I'd like to open it for discussion because I've already, exceeded my 20 minutes, but I just want to talk about the last two concepts that I have on this slide. Which is BIPOC, which in the context of the United States is indigenous and people of color feminisms. And these are feminisms that are really challenging the settler coloniality. They're talking about, for example, reparations, right? Giving the land back to indigenous communities. For the case of African Americans, they want reparations for slavery, the labor that was, in some ways, absolutely free labor that essentially, ensured the survival, not only the survival, but the flourishing of capitalism. So the critique then that comes from indigenous and Black color of feminism, which you sometimes see in Black Lives Matter, is really about getting land back. It's about reparations. It's a critique in some ways then also of capitalism, right? Because giving land back, reparations, really in some ways challenges capitalism itself, because capitalism was built on the backs of genocide of indigenous peoples, taking land away from them, and of course the enslavement and the free labor of African Americans. So that's kind of an example of what today decolonial feminists, who call themselves and as BIPOC feminists are asking for. So you kind of see the shift from what I mentioned earlier, from women's liberation to talking about sexuality, to talking about intersectionality. This is a kind of a very fundamental critique of rethinking what we mean by feminism. In India, if you think about it, and one of the articles that I shared was about the debates between Dalit and autonomous feminists, right? And so in India today, I've sort of coined, this feminism myself, which is Adivasi Bahujan Dalit feminist, right? So what do we have now? You know, in terms of the Dalit feminists critiquing the fact that most of the feminists, you know, particularly in autonomous movements, but also in the left movements, have been Savarna feminists, right? And to what extent does caste then become so invisibly erased that we don't even think about what it means to think about Dalit women and their experiences, right? So we might have Dalit women's experiences, but what are the ways in which, you know, the hegemony of caste still colors even those feminists who are open, right, to critique from Dalit feminism? That is, how does caste, in some ways, the logic of the hierarchy, of graded hierarchy that, you know, Ambedkar talked about, still continues in some ways to shape not just Dalit women's lives, but also feminism in India. And similarly, you know, we can think about Bahujan and Adivasi feminists making similar claims about what are the ways in which those of us, you know, who are in some ways called Dalit or Savarna, don't even think about the logic of caste that informs, for example, the way we think about what are the alternatives to, you know, the question that was asked earlier about, is there an alternative to incarceration, right? And I sort of just want to give an example because it's related to that of in the Amish community. The Amish are a group in the United States who come from German extraction, and they still follow a very particular kind of Christianity. And so they don't use a lot of modern technology, and they still kind of, you know, wear clothes that are what men wore in the 19th century. They drive in horse and buggies. They don't, you know, use motorized vehicles. There was a big case of rape in that community. And of course, you know, it went through the legal system. But in the end, where the rape had happened and it was, you know, kind of a mass rape, they decided that they didn't really want to follow, you know, the carceral logic only. So they raised the place. It was a schoolhouse in which the rapes had happened, and then actually built another center for reconciliation and for peace. And a way it was for them to sort of forgive the rapists, not only kind of, you know, let it go through the criminal system, but to kind of think about a different logic and a different way of dealing with sexual violence and gender violence in, you know, in this particular instance. So then I think to kind of wrap up, I think reflexivity is, I think, the strongest element of feminisms and why it has continued to sort of evolve and change and address issues as they change, because globalization, as we know, for the last 20 years has really changed a lot of ways in which women experience both new kinds of oppression, but the same ways in which feminisms has also had new spaces to interact with each other through transnational feminisms, through solidarities across borders, and to learn from each other. Not that, you know, there are answers that Western feminists have or Indian feminists have, but what are the kind of absences in our thinking about feminism? What are the lacunas, and how can we then be open to those lacunas and engage with our critiques to come up with, you know, new forms of feminisms? And so kind of, you know, decoloniality to me represents decolonial feminism, kind of the most recent iteration of reflexivity within feminism. And I think it keeps it, you know, dynamic and changing, and I think relevant to, you know, what we find ourselves. And I want to just kind of end with a little bit that another of the sort of reflexivity along with decoloniality is with climate justice. And feminists are very key to, you know, not only the conversations about climate justice, but actually what can be done. And I want to end with, you know, my just recent, I'm doing some exploratory research in Maharashtra with Savayam Sikshan Prayog. And there, women farmers have developed this 1 acre model, which is a climate resilient agriculture model where they use organic means, even the seeds, water harvesting, you know, all of the ways. And they've kind of actually been doing this model for almost the past 10 years and looking at the way, and these are primarily, you know, Dalit or Bahujan women, and the ways in which they've brought in both feminism, but also climate justice work, you know, to talk about the ways in which feminism needs to change and shift with the issues that women experience, you know, not just in India, but everywhere. So I think that's kind of where I'd like to wrap it up and then open it for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. At this point, I'd like to have Professor VIBHUTI ma'am to provide us with any remarks she has.
Yeah, I think my only remark is that now how the transnational feminism and also the global solidarity that you are talking, how are we relate to the other equally liberating forces, whether it's a working class, informal sector, or those who have been at the like LGBTQIA movement, and also the movement of Adivasis and Dalit, this thing. So the Dalit feminism and Adivasi feminism, they have challenged the mainstream feminists who are very much into more narcissist and more focused on the individuation that is happening in a big way. And the 21st century neoliberalism has also influenced the feminist discourses. So how do you think that we can transcend that? Because the decoloniality and post-coloniality you are talking about, will it just remain in the academia, or we can popularize it and take it to every walk, every sphere of life? No?
I would say that actually this is not just academia. In fact, academia have articulated this based on what women are doing. So for example, this whole idea of reparations, these are people on the ground working, with their communities, with their, state legislators and even national legislators to come up with reparations. They've done work on what actually it would cost, who are the actual descendants of the enslaved, what it was about 5 million Africans who were taken to the Americas. So yeah, so this is not an academic debate at all. The academic articulations are actually reflecting the work that's happening on the ground. Similarly with, indigenous communities, what they're doing around climate justice, taking land back. And the example, that's why I ended with the example of Swayam Shikshan Prayog. They are actually working with, these are Dalit and Bahujan women doing this 1 acre model. And they've been working with, agricultural university in the state of Maharashtra. They're also trying to work, and they also work with, similarly poor rural women working in Turkey and Africa. So I think the transnational solidarities are happening at many levels. So I think, what we have, and this is to me the strength of feminisms, that there are multiple feminisms happening, not just in India, but everywhere. And a lot of these feminisms are articulating with their sort of, what one could say their compadres in different parts of the world. So if you think about the World March of Women, or if you think about, even at the grassroots level, women are engaging. So the transnational solidarities and transnational feminism is not just the feminism at the United Nations or of, highly educated professional women like some of us here, but it's the feminisms of the Huayra Commission, for example. Those are all grassroots women. Viego are all informal sector domestic workers working with each other. So I think the solidarities are happening at a lot of different levels between lots of different kinds of women, grassroots, Dalit, Adivasi. So I think we in the academy, and again, I don't see myself only as an academic, but I'm also always engaged with movements. And so I think I learn from what I see on the ground, and that's kind of what gets reflected in what I write about. So I think there's a very healthy exchange in feminism between those of us who might be primarily in the academy and those of us, who are primarily activists.
I think we need to amplify the voices of such inspiring.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Excellent. Yeah.
Ma'am, we have some questions.
Yeah.
Anjali ji, can you please ask your question?
Anjali Bosch, yeah. It's written in the Q&A.
Yes, I can read it out if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
So they're asking, how would you react?
And I think in some ways, I think I already answered that in response to Dr. Patel's that, yes, I think there are different discourses, which is why I said what you see in, for example, the United States right now is reparation feminism, is, feminisms of take back the land. That's not happening in India. In India, as I said, you see this 1 acre model, which is trying to address issues of climate justice. We also have different kinds of, Adivasi women who are also working around, we still have issues of preventing the construction of dams, so around their kind of land and farming movements. If you think about farmers in Deccan or in Maharashtra against farmer suicide. So yes, of course, the issues are going to be different because even though we are in a global world, the way that these global forces land in different countries is shaped very much by the histories of those countries, by, the complex social, economic, and political dynamics in those countries. So yes, the issues are going to be different, and which is why, you cannot have feminists from one place going to the other. So the solidarities is different feminists talking about their own issues, but you can, learn from each other. And I think that's already happening a lot. Just a recent example, because there was an earthquake in Turkey, for example. So the Swayam Sikshan Prayog women that I mentioned, that actually started after the Latur earthquake in Maharashtra in 1993. These women then, these are poor women who learned how to, work with what was happening. They actually went to Turkey then in 2001 when there was, an earthquake, and shared the ways in which they had worked with their local NGOs, with their local politicians. And now they were just, I was there last week after the recent earthquake in Turkey. And this women in Maharashtra were telling me, now we don't need to go to Turkey because we've already been working with them for the past 10 years. So they've already learned, and now they communicate, everybody's texting, all the rural women have WhatsApp, they're doing Zoom, meetings. So yes, the discourses are different, but there are also ways in which we can share, like earthquakes, when that happens, and what happens to women in particular, and how do we help them to navigate and learn to work, for rehabilitation. What are the issues that, those are things that women on the ground have learned. And so we can kind of, share those.
These inspiring stories only keep us going, no? In terms
Yeah.
of, it provides us tonic too.
Absolutely.
And faith in the humanity.
Yep, absolutely.
There is one more question by Anita Ravishankar.
Let me see.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I think in terms of time, if you were to look into the time factor, I think the person who has coined the word of decolonial feminism would have been Maria Lugon, I think, sometime in the late first decade of the 21st century. No,
I would disagree.
8 or so.
Hmm.
Yeah, but then she, if you were to look into Chilla Bulbeck's feminism, where she talks about a declination narrative, where she talks about the colonized woman who had status and power, but we had lost it under the white patriarchal rule of colonialism. Would that come under decolonial feminism?
Yeah, but I would just say that I don't think Maria Lugones coined the term. She's an Argentinian feminist. I think Linda Smith in New Zealand had already been writing about it in the 80s. And she talks about decolonial feminist methodologies. Her book, is from 1985.
Okay.
So that's kind of one. I think in a way what, you're suggesting about, women being empowered before colonization, I think that's different. For in the case of India, the caste system predates colonialism. There were caste-based hierarchies. And so maybe, some caste women had, some amount of, privilege or power, but not all women were empowered. But so to me, I think what you're suggesting is, yeah, decolonial feminism is a way of looking at a much longer history of women. And I think we've been kind of doing that women are not universally oppressed. Women also have agency. So kind of recognizing that women's agency is complicated and it's constrained depending on your caste, class, religion, but that women have always been historical agents. And that one could say, would be, I wouldn't say just part of decolonial feminism. I think that's really part of feminist reflexivity in some ways. Or also if you think about intersectional feminism, when we talk about, the ways in which Black women in the US or Dalit women in the, in India have actually had to work and had to therefore, express themselves and had some amount of power, to negotiate the dynamics that they found themselves in. So that's kind of what I would say, because I think the historical record on which we can make claims about women being empowered before colonization are not that great. It's patchy, but we do have some evidence of the ways in which women did, and forget talking about, just now, but even in hunter-gatherer societies, we think about men as hunters, but now we have a lot of anthropological evidence that actually suggests that women also hunted and were just as important, to the survival of early, human societies anywhere in the world, right? So that kind of record and, evidence, as we have new evidence, we kind of need to rethink our understanding of who was empowered, who was not, who had agency and, who was oppressed and who were the oppressors, right? And we all know that in our own lives, we have agency, but there are still constraints under which we all live, right? Constraints of, whatever it is, right? In India, whether it's, arranged marriages, whether it's family, society, and we have, more and more. And, as women get some economic power, they have certain kinds of freedoms, but it still comes with a lot of, constraints.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Yeah.
Ma'am, should we take one more question?
Yeah.
Okay. We have another question where Sanjana ji is asking about the role of social media in facilitating transnational feminism. Would it have been possible without the help of social media?
Oh, yes, because if you think about transnational feminism, it dates to the 19th century when we did not have social media. So when you think about, feminists, if you think about Annie Besant coming here, feminists, from the US going to the UK, feminists from Chile going. So I think transnational feminism has a long history, but definitely social media, and the ease of communication makes it very different, right? So this is now connection in real time. And it's connection between all different communities, as I mentioned. So you have Dalit communities in India communicating with poor communities in Turkey. That would not have been possible without social media, right? So transnational feminism has, a longer 100-year history, but definitely social media has made it easy. But, women, and Vibhuti knows this from, the women's conferences in the UN from 75, there was no internet, internet came. I remember going to the Beijing conference, 1995 was the first time we could actually send emails, right? This was not social media, it was just emails. And of course, now, we have instant communication with WhatsApp and all of that. And absolutely that plays a role. But I think we've also seen the danger of kind of this, cancel culture and cyber feminism, which also leads to all kinds of very instantaneous press, kind of circulation of false information, conspiracy theories, all of that also happens. So social media in some ways, is also a very complex, medium through which we interact with, everybody, but definitely it facilitates, transnational solidarities. It definitely facilitates our ability to communicate, across different borders within India, because we have lots of borders even in India between urban, rural. I'm right now in a very small town when I was growing up called Valsad, and now it's, a big concrete jungle. There are, all kinds. So there are also, borders within India between towns and cities, not just rural and urban, but what we call tier 1 cities and tier 2 cities and the metros. And, women and feminisms and their experiences in all of these places are very different. So, yeah.
There is a last question, I think, that is about Dakota Access Pipeline controversy.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there too, I think, you did see feminist, indigenous feminists, Black feminists, and indigenous movements come together. And for now, at least in the US part, the Dakota pipeline was stopped, right? But what is happening in Canada, because the pipeline goes from Canada all the way to the US, that Canada has, decided that they're going to continue. So at least the US part has stalled, the Canadian part hasn't. What will happen, we're not sure. But what it did do is, again, kind of highlight the ways in which indigenous communities and their lands have become, wastelands through which to put all these, very dangerous pipelines that would destroy their sacred land and their relationship to the land. So land is becoming, in indigenous communities, a very big issue. And I think that's actually very crucial, because it's not only land for them to take back, but it's also land in relation to climate change, in relation to all of our relations, which was a term coined by anthropologists, that all our relations means our relations with humans, with other species, with non-humans, and of course also non-sentient beings, which is stones and mountains and rivers, and how do we, so yeah, I think the Dakota pipelines, movement was very, very important, I think, in influencing a lot of younger generations of people in the Americas, both in Canada and the United States, in changing their sensibility about indigenous cosmology, their relationship to land, and their relationship to other living beings, both living beings, other species, and non-living entities.
Thank you, ma'am. We are indeed very grateful that you could join us in this session.
Thank you.
We would like to move on
Recording session. Yeah.
with the final for this session.
Yeah, I think my previous 4 speakers have made my task easy. So I think so many things which I wanted to say have already been covered. And now I think I will, yeah. My presentation is based on Indian experience of praxis and feminist theorization. And yeah. So it's visible? Is my presentation visible? Yeah. So I think the fundamentals of feminism and praxis in India, the first of all, like the historiography of feminism and how the conventional thinking and how the feminism changed the conventional discourses throughout the civilization was covered beautifully by Dr. Leena Pujari yesterday, but I would like to emphasize that it is not the Western origin of feminism. We already had feminist expressions in Therigathas in Magadhi that were written in 1880 BCE by the Buddhist bhikkhunis. The dialogue between Lord Buddha and the bhikkhunis also talks about the concerns. They also talked about housewives, widows, aristocratic women, they call them prostitutes, what we call sex workers, beggars, their lives, they were concerned about them and the pains of domestic duty, pains of child bearing, pains of desertion by men. All these issues were captured by the Therigathas, by the bhikkhunis in the nearly 2000 years back. Then we have in the 11th century, we had Akka Mahadevi's Vachanas, where she talked about Akka Mahadevi, her life, she was a very beautiful woman. King was enchanted by her. And Akka Mahadevi's interests were more in spiritualism. And she said that she would marry the king only if there is no restriction on her life, which never happened after marriage. There were so many restrictions. Akka Mahadevi finally left palace. She gave up everything, including her ornaments and her clothes. Her hair only covered her body. She was roaming around. She was homeless, but whosoever invited her, she accepted their hospitality. Her vachanas are extremely beautiful and they are very revealing about the status of women and her concern about liberation that every person needs to have. And we had in Janabai's, Sant Jnaneshwar's sister, Janabai, in 1350, she also wrote so many abhangas which talked. Janabai also had an extremely painful childhood. Both her parents had committed suicide by drowning in the sea. And these 4 children, 3 brothers and one Janabai, they were left to fend for themselves. Society treated them very harshly. And Janabai started writing abhangas. That was her way of getting salvation in those harsh circumstances. Her abhangas are 340 devotional songs that Janabai wrote, talked about the freedom, liberty, autonomy, dignity of a human person. Lal Dev from Kashmir in the 14th century, from 1320 to 1392, she wrote a mystic poetry, and Lal Dev's verses are known as Vak in Kashmiri. And they also talked, they have universal appeal. Now also you can listen to the Vak on YouTube. So there are so many artists who are singing them. Similarly, we also had Habba Khatun, who was a princess, and she also gave up her palace life. She constructed hut next to the river, and she always led a life of a very austere life, but she was accessible. She did not, none of them believed in a caste system. They challenged the caste system. They transcended the barriers and restrictions posed by the hierarchy within in a varnashram. This thing, and that's why they became a rebellion. Their action, individual actions, they faced tremendous witch hunting and oppression from the community as well as from the state, but they never relented. They never gave up their quest for liberation. Similarly, Mirabai, a lot is written. If you see Parita Mukta's feminist analysis of Mirabai, published by Cambridge University Press, that shows that even recently, like when she was doing field work in Chittorgarh, she never came across any girl named Mirabai. And she asked the people that why haven't they named their daughters Mirabai, where whole world, even all over India, she has been highly respected. They said, we don't approve of the kind of life Mirabai left, living the palace, roaming around on the like a pariah, mixing with people, common people, people from, according to them, quote unquote, lower caste, and singing bhajanas anywhere. That was not acceptable to them. And that they saw Mirabai as a rebel. We also had, and then what Dr. Leena Pujari told yesterday about the vindication of rights of women with strictures on political and moral subjects that created a ripple effect in the 18th century throughout the Europe. And that's what the official Western history of feminism talks about, starting of the new feminist movement with the liberal understanding that women demanding right to vote as equal citizens. We also had, now also Bainabai's ovis are extremely popular. Bainabai was a peasant woman. She wrote so many ovis. She was herself illiterate, but her son was literate, who whenever, while working, while collecting fuel, fodder, water, looking after animals, or cooking at home, she would be constantly singing her ovis, the verses, and the child, her son, this was in 19th century. And in all her ovis, what you see is the double standards of sexual morality. She challenges pain of women, daughter-in-laws. She has described the grind of daily routine, where there is an extremely popular song, which is also Marathi film industry has also popularized it greatly. That is also very important, where she talks about. Then in the 19th century, Savitribai Phule's work, Savitribai Phule and Fatima Sheikh, who became the first teacher of modern education, Tarabai Shinde, who challenged the double standards of sexual morality. 1 minute. And so, and they started this first school for girls and socially rejected, socially ostracized women. Their hand holding was done. Tarabai's work, Sri Purush Tulna, has been translated by Gail Omwet into English. We also had a case of Rakmabai Save, where she was a victim of child marriage. She challenged her child marriage, and she also, for which her husband opted for restitution of conjugal right. And during colonial times, any woman who did not respect the restitution of conjugal right and refused to cohabit with husband, there was a penalty, was imprisonment. Rakmabai said she was ready for imprisonment, and she also challenged she said that instead of staying with this man who is not, in no way he's a match to me, I would prefer to be in jail. And she wrote an open letter to Viceroy of India. Viceroy of India, and then that beautiful letter, it is still there on internet, you can read them, where she asked that does Indian girl have any right to determine her own destiny? Can she shape her life the way she wants? Does she have a right to consent in case of what she wants to do with her life? So, and we had a very major polemics about the age of consent bill. And after that, the age of consent was decided as 16 years. So anyone who married their daughter below 16 was committing a crime. And Rakmabai played a very important role. She, in the freedom movement, she became a doctor, and she never got married. She was in Pune when it became difficult for her to stay there. She was invited by Chhatrapati Shahu Maharaj, a progressive king of Kolhapur, to become a chief medical officer. She's the first surviving woman doctor, because Anandibai Joshi, she became a doctor, but she died of tuberculosis. While Rakmabai Save, she helped in a civil hospital construction of civil hospital in Pune, in Kolhapur. She was invited in Surat also for to build civil hospital. She was invited by King of Baroda, King of Bhavnagar, and she played a very important role and died at the ripe age of 96. So throughout her life, like she dedicated her life for the nation building and for making the public health system robust. We yesterday, Dr. Pujari also told us about the Seneca Fall and in 19th century, 1848, how women gave a manifesto of women's rights, and there was a women's rights convention on July 19th and 20th, and they came up with and the working class women also played a very important role. And we saw the 8th March 1910, when the whole world was rife with the jingoism and all countries were preparing for the First World War. It was the women of the world, and especially social democrat women, who came out in open, and they said that they did not want, we don't want bullets, we want bread. We don't want tanks, we want milk for our children. And this is a very popular song on Bread and Roses, where women were marching and they were singing this song. There are various versions of this song. You can listen to them on YouTube. Now, coming to our own freedom movement in India, the elements of feminism and assertion of women's rights were there. All those who were active in the public life, first of all, they were social reformers. They defied child marriage. They defied girls being not allowed to get education. They also took part and they also defied seclusion of women in domesticity. They joined the public life. Not only that, they used their lung power, they used their tongue power, they used the power of pen to motivate thousands of women to fight against the British colonialism, and especially after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. There's a person like Simi Mehta. She was running the underground radio, Voice of India, at the time, and connecting and networking different freedom movements, different movements that were taking place for freedom of India in different parts of the country. We also saw that during the colonial times, when Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru talked about his dream of independent India and what would be the India planned economic development in India, women members in Congress, they also talked about that what will be the role of 50% of India's population in the independent India. In your dream, how do you see their role? And then the committee was appointed, and they also came up with a very important document. You can download it. It is very much there in the public domain. And it also
Ma'am, you got muted somehow.
I will. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So what we see is that Hansaben Mehta and Kapilaben Khandwala were sent as a representative of India in the discussion in the UN meeting, where the UDH, the Universal Declaration of Men's Rights was being discussed. Hansaben Mehta, Kapilaben, both of them stood up in the UN General Assembly, and they said that what kind of declaration you are coming up, where 50% of world's population is left out. And this, Hansaben suggested that it should, instead of men's rights, it should become human rights. And the special committee was formed under chairpersonship of Madam Roosevelt. Hansaben was also inducted in that committee, and they did major rehauling of the Universal Declaration of Men's Rights and inserted women's concerns and the concerns of the colonial regimes and colonial and post-colonial societies in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. After the India's independence, when the repatriation of women and children in the refugee camps was happening, these three women played a very important role. Srimati Pushpaben Mehta, Kamlaben Patel, and Mridulaben Sarabhai, all of them were they were active as a freedom fighters. Gandhiji and Dr. Pandit Nehru had assigned them this task to manage the refugee camps. And when they were asked to take a ministerial berth for their heroic work. All of them refused that, but they gave advice to the Prime Minister that if these women in the refugee camps who are abandoned by their families, by their in-laws and by their parental family, it is the duty of the state to look after them. And they said if their work is respected, then the state should the government should come up with the allocation of institutionalization of Central Social Welfare Board. They gave the suggestion that what we need is a Central Social Welfare Board with adequate fund so that this abandoned women and quote unquote illegitimate children who were raped by quote unquote enemies, Hindu, Sikh and Muslim women could rebuild their lives. So you can imagine the kind of concern and the universal solidarity these women believed in. Now, oh my God. When the Constitution of India was formed at that time, we saw that nearly so several women, like 15 women, were inducted from the freedom movement who were very articulate, who had courage of conviction, who were never British rulers could never lure them into betrayal, and they stood by the freedom movement, and they were highly gifted women. They had courage of conviction. They were good orator. They were good thinker and also public intellectuals. So Amu Swaminathan Begum, Aizaz Rasool, Dakshayani Velayuddin, Durgabai Deshmukh, Hansaben Mehta, Kamala Chaudhary, Leela Roy, Malti Chaudhary, Purnima Banerjee, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, Renuka Ray, Sarojini Naidu, Suchita Kriplani, Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, Annie Mascarenas, all of them were played a very important role both in drafting of Constitution of India, especially fundamental rights and directive principles. Those who think that Indian women got right to vote on platter, they are also they are misled, because if you see the correspondence and the debates in the archives of about the Indian freedom movement, it was these women who were articulating and they were demanding that women should be treated as equal citizens. Dakshayani Velayuddin, she was the only one in this whole group, in this 15 highly gifted women who came from an extremely who came from the very extremely marginalized community. They were the Pulayas of Kerala. And you know that the Dalits were not even allowed to cover their chest. Dakshayani had to really fight the caste-based exclusion and stigmatization. She got educated, her brother supported her, and she became very active in the freedom movement. Gandhiji saw her talent and she was also inducted, and she was an extremely gifted person. And her daughter is now, she was the president of Indian Association for Women's Studies in our last term. Now, coming to what happened up in the post-independence period, that most of the women who were in the leadership role in the freedom movement, they either joined the government as an institution builder. Some of them became very famous educationists. Person like Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay dedicated her life for building khadi and village industry, and some of them joined the foreign service and active politics. But large number of women who had crossed the boundary of domesticity and entered the freedom movement, they again just became domesticated. And the only one thing that happened, that middle class of India realized that educating a girl is important. So that one thing. But it was in the 70s that the new movements, global movements of students, especially the African liberation struggle, the struggles of the oppressed masses in Latin America, or the American bombing in Vietnam, and the students and youth movement for solidarity of Vietnam, I think they played a very important role in attracting so many educated students, educated women and the students in the universities to be active in the larger social movement, which talked about the social transformation. But they realized that these transformatory processes were relegating women's question at the background. And here came the role of new first wave of feminism, where there were a liberal Marxist and socialist feminists who also had given the legacy of how to organize and self-mobilize, which supported the second wave feminism, in which person like us who got revolutionized due to our solidarity activities of the post-colonial or the liberation struggles in various against decolonization as well as against the colonial regime, overthrowing the colonial regime. And here, as yesterday, all these different waves of feminism were discussed in detail, whether radical feminism, psychoanalytical feminism, ecofeminism, Black feminism, all of them started articulating, and these were not in the realm of ideas, but they were already practicing at a ground level. Third wave feminism, which we say that we see after the 1990s and all, where the womanism and the post-structuralized interpretations of gender and sexuality and even the identity became very important concern. And fourth wave feminism, as yesterday, Dr. Leena Pujari also told us, which focused on sexual harassment, body shaming, rape culture, identity, backed by the use of social media to highlight and address these concerns. So what we see is that gender politics defined by the disciplines such as literature, politics, art, culture, cultural criticism, history, sociology at one level in the academic discourses, and also more and more popular movements also were getting attracted to this kind of discourses. Third wave essentially covered the perspectives from those marginalized and excluded from previous waves of feminism, as Dr. Manisha also told us, that how Dalit women, tribal women, women of color, women from the post-colonial women, young women, differently abled women, women from ethnic and religious minorities, and women with alternate sexuality. And they also emphasize need for transcending gender binary of man and women, and transgender solidarity with the transgender community is very important. Third wave acknowledges the benefits of second wave and provides worldview of young feminists of the global south. What we saw that while the diversity in the social fabric of India has historically seen continuities and contestations both, interactions between different social segments have increasingly come to be mediated through the socioeconomic processes, because we know massive changes that happened after the new economic policy, globalization, liberalization, marketization that happened after 1991, not only in India, but most of the countries, the post-colonial countries, had to accept stabilization policies, macroeconomic stabilization policies, which resulted in massive reduction in the social sector budget, states' role not for welfare but only for coercion, and oppressive hand of state became far more pronounced when the people's discontent started coming up against inflation, against unemployment. So the issues around identity and culture impacting on gender relations have come center stage now in the globalized world of 21st century. And we have environmental policies, the action of livelihood concerns, the question of land, the Chipko movement we started in 1972, Apiko movement during 80s, and now Save Amazon movement, which was started by the Latin American feminists, and eco-feminists have also now become far more vocal in terms of support to the green movement and the kind of experiments which Dr. Manisha told us about, that climate justice, that is what is a major demand. The livelihood concerns were taken up by the women, and so many in the rural areas, in the forest areas, in places like Manipur, where the Maire Paibas or Naga Mothers Association in Nagaland, Nari Adhikar Sangram Samiti in Assam, Assam Mahila Sachetan Manch, Northeast Network, all of them have taken up very important issues where they have to fight, they have to face both types of assaults, either from the militant outfits and also rebel organizations and also by the state. What we see is that reproductive rights of women have been central concern with the draconian population policies that were implemented and imposed during the emergency. What we see is that it was the feminist movement which pressurized the global agencies as well as the states within their own countries to shift the discourse from reproductive control to reproductive rights, and also the question of new reproductive technology, the questioning of the new reproductive technology, whether it was a population control policy or assisted reproduction or genomics or sex selective technologies. In fact, we had a very strong movement of against sex selection and the use of sonography and other sex selection technologies for femicide. Feminism has also now the disabled women from disabled movement. They have also come up with the many many publications, and also they have created their own forum, and they are now part of most of the feminist discourses where the multifarious and marginalized position which women with disability have to suffer, and what it becomes the identity marker, and the daily experiences of them are perplexing and difficult. So taking up their agenda and also question of solidarity with the persons with disability has become a very important, serious concern. In fact, our president of Indian Association of Women's Studies, in the previous 2 terms, she was Dr. Anita Ghai. She has extensively written on gender, disability, and the question of and class also, and with the intersectional perspective. Sexual harassment at workplace, which is a major occupational hazard of the 21st century, has become a very important concern. When the internal complaints committee are not giving any justice, women have to use the social media. In the Me Too movement after 2017 also created a major polarization among the feminists who are part of the system, who are enjoying high-powered positions within the existing system. They did not support it, while the young feminists who are facing multifarious power structures oppressing their existential reality, I think they are the ones who have come together and supported and are very vociferous in support of the Me Too movement. We have seen that also breaking the glass ceiling in the corporate world also, so many feminists, and I think whether you consider them to be part of the transformatory process, but what we see is that major challenge which that women are posing, whether they are in administrative structures, judiciary, corporate world, political structures, and educational institutions. I think that is also the new confidence that the feminist movement has given to this upwardly mobile section of society, which you may call them, as Dr. Roxana yesterday said. They may not be part of the 99% of women, but 1% of these women, but they also are challenging the patriarchal forces. Gender politics and the health movement has been a very important concern, where women are feminists have always demanded life cycle approach from womb to tomb, not only the focus on reproductive health care, health concerns, where women are treated mainly as a breeder, and 15 to 49 age group gets the attention of the state and non-state actors, but the children's, women in the girl child or aging women, their concerns also need to be taken up, and also general occupational related issues, nutritional needs, the lifestyle issues, they are also equally important. Feminists have also are very active in the conflict zones, whether it is Northeast or Kashmir, or even they have, as Dr. Vaida told us about that, how Armed Forces Special Power Act, where the any accused in the army or in a state military or paramilitary forces, they are absolved of their crime of rape or sexual violence. That has been challenged by the feminist movement. It is still a work in progress, because Verma Committee, only two recommendations of Verma Committee were not accepted by the Indian Parliament. One was on marital rape, about which also a lot of discussions are happening now, and whether the armed forces are immune to any kind of trial if they resort to sexual violence. what we see is that the question of sex work, earlier the second generation of feminists used to call it, see it only in the rubric of violence because it was sex work, what we call now. It was considered as a prostitution, and prostitution was always linked with the coercion, trafficking. And so if you see the feminists of my generation, they would see it under the rubric of violence, while the younger generation of feminists, they see that it is like any other kind of work. And what we need is that making it devoid of violence and respecting their right to unionize, demanding health and safe conditions. And the question of Devdasis, Jognis, Murlis, or Kalavantris of Maharashtra, they also face so much of exploitation, caste-based exploitation, their question of livelihood, the question of their coarse sexuality, that they have also been taken up. And there are several studies and also in actual support to these organizations which are suffering because of the Victorian morality, and the social reform movement also was so Brahminical that they had not even taken up their question. The question of sexual violence, I think I need not say, we had a whole session by Dr. Vaida, who discussed the threadbare analysis and provided the very comprehensive view of the feminist activism and feminist analysis of the sexual violence issues. Then come to the LGBTQI movement, where whether it's gays or lesbians, hijra, transgender, kotis, now feminists are having very serious dialogue. They also are fighting against the homophobic arguments, and in action also providing support to those who are persecuted and providing solidarity, working with them, attending their rallies, and also inviting them on the feminist platforms. I think that's very important. Intersectionality has been emphasized by all speakers from yesterday's two presentation, today two presentation before me. And I think that is the now universally acceptable position which feminists have taken. Feminists have, some feminists in the third wave have become far more powerful, whether it as a NGO heads or the institution in various institutions of economic or cultural or political or educational institutions, and they are also furthering the feminist cause. Still, we have so many unresolved issues. I think about the age of consent, I think Vaida session should have taken it up, that should a boy in age group of 16 to 18 accused of rape is to be punished, he should be treated as a child, or major or minor. It is still an unresolved issue. Honor crimes, about which not much is done, except for a couple of very progressive judgments which Supreme Court gave. But otherwise, still, it is becoming thousands of young lives are lost because of when they have choice-based marriage, intercaste or interreligious marriages. Feminists have to address this question seriously. Masum is the organization, and the feminists like Dr. Manisha Gupte have taken up this issue. The question of discriminatory family laws which discriminate between men and women in most intimate areas of marriage, divorce, custody of child, land rights, or right to matrimonial home, right to guardianship of a child. They follow double standards, and increasing number of women have challenged the discriminatory aspects within these religion-based family laws in the lower courts or high courts or Supreme Courts of India. We have some of the landmark judgments where women they managed to get certain rights, like Mary Roy's questioning of Travancore Syrian Christian personal law and equal property right for brother and sister and men and women in the Syrian Christian community, or Shehnaz Sheikh, who has challenged Sharia. So some 6 women who also challenged triple talaq just in 2017. The Supreme Court has criminalized triple talaq. We have 2 Hindu sisters, Lata Mittal and a sister, who challenged the Hindu property right. And now the daughters are also equal. Daughters can also have equal share in the ancestral property. We also have a Parsi lady who filed the public interest litigation against weapon of social boycott used by the Parsi Panchayat if a Parsi woman marries a non-Parsi man, while the same, if a non-Parsi man marries Parsi woman, if a Parsi man marries a non-Parsi woman, nothing happens to him. So this kind of challenges. We also have a 30,000 customary laws, and some of the customary laws are extremely anti-women, and younger generation of women are now, first of all, family laws or the customary laws which deprived women of land rights were challenged by Laro Janko in Singhbhum and Guribai and Dakibai in Maharashtra way back in 1986. And now we see the taboos regarding menstruation, the isolation of a woman or a girl in a tribal village during menstruation. That is a customary practice that is also challenged by so many young women. Even the question of virginity test among Kanjarvat community has been challenged by the couple, which sees it as extremely humiliating and degrading when on a first night whole family examines the white bedsheet of which the couples have used, and if there are no spot of blood, then that girl, the husband is forced to just desert the wife. This is an extremely draconian measure with that community follow, and the younger generation of people are challenging that. A question of temple entry, whether it was the entry of a temple in Maharashtra or in Kerala, which created massive religious polarization, and also the entry into the sanctum sanctorum of a mosque in Mumbai, Haji Ali Dargah, that was challenged by Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan. Abortion of quote-unquote abnormal fetus, which the law has written, has been challenged by the feminists in the disability movement. Bar dancing, whether do you support bar dancing or you should ask for a ban on bar dancing. About that also, feminist movement has been polarized. There are feminists who see bar dancing as nothing but a violation of women's bodily integrity due to economic distress, and they played a very, very crucial role in banning of bar dancing in Maharashtra, while there are feminists who see bar dancing as any other activity. What they demand is the safety of the bar dancer. Whether you call sex work is a work or a coercion, again, a very controversial issue. Feminist positions are polarized. Commercial use of nuclear technology, about that also feminists are. There are some who say that we should oppose nuclear energy per se because it is harmful, and especially after Chernobyl and the nuclear disaster in Japan, lot of material they are using against it. While there are feminists who say that because there is so much of crisis of energy, women are using harmful fuel for cooking because they don't have clean energy. Why can't we use nuclear energy? Again, a very sensitive topic. Genetically modified grains and vegetables and fruits. There are some who say that what we need is a more food production. We need more production in the agriculture sector. And there are ecofeminists and there are many who say that what we need is organic farming. While after the Sri Lankan crisis, because of the policy of Sri Lankan government to go for organic farming, which drastically reduce agricultural production, again, a lot of rethinking is going on. That can we use chemical fertilizers? Can we use the genome technology for increasing the productivity of agriculture? Long-acting hormonal contraceptives have been, again, you see the younger feminists, they don't see so much of harm, while my generation of feminists had vehemently opposed any hormone-based contraceptives, which can have a dire implication on the whole body of women with the estrogen progesterone combination imbalance. While recently, when any discourses on contraceptives, they don't see it as a problem. In fact, we had opposed the RU486 emergency contraception, while the younger generation, they say that no, we have to only take care of the anemia. But if you have enough HB level, it cannot be harmful. See, French women have been using emergency, the RU486, but their HB level, hemoglobin level is 14, while that of Indian would be 7 to 8. So when you already are anemic, can you have this kind of emergency contraception, which would make you bleed heavily? Feminists are using social media. There was a question also earlier about how feminists are using social media. I think for past 20 years, we see that feminist archives or Feminist India Yahoo groups, Prajna Archives, Sparrow, Ava by Vadia Archives, Center for Women's Development Studies, and Feminist Policy India, all of them have deprivatized their knowledge sources and knowledge production. So you have photographic memories, reports, posters, diaries, songs, documentary on women's issues available online. It is just one click away. So I think this is a very important development that feminist movement all over the world and in India also we have had. When it comes to, say, the peacemaking, peace building and peacekeeping forces, I think initially these efforts were made in Northeast Kashmir and always after any caste or communal riots took place. So now there is a more sensitivity and the healthy curiosity about learning from other South Asian countries, like Nepal or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Pakistan, how our peace efforts are being made. And the resolution, and Vaida has given best years of her life for her, this kind of effort with the UN, the resolution 1325 of the UN Security Council for Women, peace, security, and like maintaining women's central position in the peace table. So it is not only that you do whatever the state tells you to do, but you should also have a voice. It's not only representation, but also voice of women is very important in the decision making regarding the peace negotiations. Global 1 Million Rising campaign, which is now extremely powerful and is backed by social media. And that's why all those places which were remote, who were not part of the earlier feminist movement, they are also now getting energy to be part of the 15 days of activism that we have from 25th November to 10th December, which was the decision which was taken by the Vienna Convention on Violence Against Women, which also adopted that women's rights are human rights. So I think this is a very important movement that happened, and Kamala Bhasin played a very important role. She was in charge of Asia. Currently, Aba Bhaiya, she is in charge of South Asia, and 1 Billion Rising has really created a very healthy atmosphere to understand feminist activism and feminist theorization and feminist proclamations. Development agenda, the gender responsive budgeting, and also using the macroeconomy, mesoeconomy, and microeconomy, engendering them, and coming up with the transformative agenda, using the finances in a transformative way. I think that also played an important role during the pandemic, where the Gender Equality Forum was created. 64 countries representatives were there, and they instituted a special fund to accelerate the development efforts so that whatever damage the pandemic had done can be reversed. Now, the list of challenges faced by feminists in a contemporary Indian society, where the question of, on the one hand, we are facing the challenge from the cultural nationalist and the sectarian forces, and at the other level, we are also seeing so much of misogyny and the backlash in the day-to-day life, in the community life. So I think the marginalization and exclusion of women, which was a cross-cutting across religions, communities, and regions, they are posing the major challenge to individual feminists and also at a society level. The most potent challenge is posed by women at the margins of heteronormative family, conventional conjugality, and patrilineal inheritance. New relationships are forced through migration for livelihood, and also confronting notion of stigma. Cultural and territorial hegemony reflected in the idea of nation state has been interrogated and articulated in a nationality movement, or specifically in the Northeast and Jammu and Kashmir. Misrepresentation and marginalization of women and their interests coincides with this hegemonic representation of Indian culture. And I think now the discourses have started as both online and in person about unpacking what is Indian culture. So last 50 years of feminist activism in India has managed to challenge the patriarchal legacy of 5,000 years. And they have also they are striking at the roots of exploitation, oppression, subjugation, and humanization. And the series of legal reforms that we have right from 1976 till 2021, you can say, where even the unpaid care economy, about which also the first time we got the time utilization studies. So gender politics in India has been very greatly influenced by the feminist activism, feminist theorization, and feminist proclamations and the writings, the vast volume of written and audiovisual material which the feminist movement has generated. I think that has played a very important role in shaping. So as I told yesterday also, that you may hate feminism, you may like feminism, but you can't ignore feminism. These are some of the very important works like Bell Hooks, about which Dr. Leena Pujari told us yesterday, Chandra Mohanty, who talked about the post-colonialism and challenged the neoliberalism and provided radical critique, about which Dr. Manisha Desai told us, Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, Maria Mies and Vandana Shiva's work on ecofeminism, Nivedita Menon's work about which Dr. Leena Pujari told us, Seeing Like a Feminist, Sharmila Rege, who unpacked the caste, class, and gender and showed the interrelationship with the intersectional perspective by going through the autobiographies of Dalit women in Marathi. And she came up with this excellent research report, which is Dalit Women Talk Differently. Our work on political feminism in India and analysis of actors, debates, and strategies, that was part of a FES agenda for Asia. I think Dr. Alia Khan, she did prepare the report for Pakistan. We had similarly from Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Philippines, so many East Asian countries also. They came up with this country reports on political feminism. And it is also available in Hindi. Feminist journals in Hindi such as Hum Sabla, published by Jaguri in Delhi, and E-Manjari by Equity Foundation Patna. They are also publicly available, and all these publications and the links I have given, they can be freely downloaded for further studies and also for further dissemination. Thank you very much. I tried to make it as fast as possible. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for such a lively and enriching session. We would quickly like to move on to a few questions. The questions are in the Q&A box, if you want to check it out now.
The larger debate against incarceration, that is, I think, what are the other possible, that is for Vaida.
Yes.
She answered that. Who are the most prominent feminist researchers in the present context? Could you please provide some research work, articles, and journals which can be read and understood? I have given both their names as well as the publications, and they are there. Their video lectures, their articles, their books, they are there in the public domain, and some of them can be freely downloaded. In the freedom struggle and immediately after independence, what you say that women who came to the forefront were educated, articulate in English language? No, they were equally, they were writing both in English and their respective languages. Dakshayani Velayuddhan wrote in Malayalam and English. Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay wrote in Bengali, Hindi, and English. And most of their public lectures were in English. If you go through the archives, even the Voice of India, which Ushaben Mehta was running as a college girl. In that also the speeches are in all languages. You can see them in Punjabi, Gujarati, Marathi, English, and their songs, because they were using that to reach out to women who were, those days the literacy rate was very low. More than 1/5 of women could at least read and write. Not all. So they were using so many folk medium, folk songs, folk tales to reach out to people. And that used to be Otherwise, you could not have such a big mass movement unless you can communicate to them. There was a movement in Manipur. I told you about that in my repibus. Yeah, 12 mothers and some aged over 60 were stripped naked in front of Assam Rifles quarter. It became a very big issue in the feminist movement. In fact, on 8th March, they paraded without any clothes, and in solidarity, even in girls in Kerala, they also did that. The only thing which covered their body was the big banner, and media was also sensitive because they took the photographs which would not give the very provocative image, but the issue of their political concern. And I think that they got this tactics from Mahashweta Devi's short story. Many of you must have read it, Dopadi, where a tribal woman, her house is ransacked. The police enters her house. They ask, her son is missing, and police says that her son must be some Naxalite or in an extreme movement. She doesn't know, and when she says she doesn't know where her son is. And after that, to demoralize her, to humiliate her in front of all villagers, they gang rape her. And after that, Dopadi comes out. Dopadi is a metaphor of Draupadi. Okay, what happened to Draupadi in Mahabharata? The same thing. She's it's a very powerful short poem, short story, which you can read. It is there on internet. And then Dopadi comes out in the morning after all this brutalization. Her body is bruised, her clothes are torn, her hair is in a shambles, and she confronts this policeman. And she says that you have ransacked me, my house. You have tried to destroy me, my body, but you can never destroy my soul. No? And if you have guts, now come to me. And she throws away whatever remaining clothes she had. She's completely naked. And all those who were there, standing there, the villagers, they lowered their eyes, which we call Najro ka parda, and they lowered their eyes. And this policemen, they are extremely scared. There is a fear on their face that this woman can have such a guts. She was a very old woman. So I think this Dopadi gave the idea to women that if you face extreme form of sexual violence, then this is the way to challenge the oppressor. So they protested against gang rape of a girl by army under Afsa, how such movements evoke a sense of feminism and how important it is for such a movement to be mobilized. In fact, this movement, it has played a very important role all over the country, because even the slut shaming that happens, no, and the rallies that took place, or even in Kerala, when they said that women should cover their chest. and the young women, they were completely, they threw off their clothes and they covered their breast with the watermelon, okay? And or you can see wherever there is a tremendous, in the tribal areas also, where the police uses the sexual violence as a weapon. Women, they just throw away their clothes and they said, okay, when I'm alone, you are harassing me, no? Now 50 of us are doing this. Now if you have guts, come here. So I think in a way it is empowering, that whatever sense of shame which the patriarchy is given you just get out of it, and you challenge the people who privately harass you, those who treat you who treat you only as a sex object, not as a human person, who don't respect your bodily integrity, who don't believe in any consensual relationship between man and women, to challenge them. And that too collectively, you are not doing it alone. No? So it has a very empowering effect. I have spoken to those girls, and they said that they feel so liberated after getting, and it made them more fearless. In fact, the women reclaiming the night. Now, what were they doing? After Nirbhaya case, that Nirbhaya was raped at night, and that's what people who asked her to go at 9:30, no? And what these children did, they said every night we will have Kenjal Vigil, and they were shouting, we reclaim the night, no? So I think it is empowering. Psychologically, it frees you from so many fears and phobias that you have. So to that extent, I would see it as a, but one thing is that you should do it collectively. If you do individually, you can face witch-hunting. It can be very, very, very cruel and barbaric.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, I think there's one more question if you want to take this.
Which one?
The last question about...
Ma'am, could you please enlighten us the issues of colorism and feminist intervention? Colorism is universal, or I have been a major victim of colorism because I was the only dark person in my whole family. It can be, it is different from racism, because racism, you are discriminating against person because of race. No? They are from a different race. But colorism can affect within the same community, within the same group, within the same household. You have one child who is a dark, another one is this thing, or even the employer's policy, fair and lovely, know that you apply fair and lovely cream and you get a job. And if you don't do that, or there is one lovely university and openly they say we don't employ or we don't give admission to anyone who is not fair, no, and lovely. So this is colorism plays a very, very damaging role with it is very, very deep rooted, because the way we talk, anything which is black or a dark, that is bad. Okay, it's a black day. Even in our language, colorism is so much, or a fair chances. No, that anything which you can call it just chances. No, but you would call it fair. So anything which is a fair, it is good, it is bright, it is just, it is desirable. And whatever is not fair or which is dark, which is, we always associate that with something depressing, negative, or even not attractive. Like I have come across cases of alleged cases of sexual harassment where the students, they say that the teacher is so dark, we are scared of him. Now, how did they get internalized? And my first case as a chairperson of ICC was that actually the teacher had no problem. He was an excellent teacher. It was the colorism of the students which made them gang up against the teacher because he happened to be of dark complexion. He was a charcoal black. And I said, I am also dark. If you are scared, go to a psychiatrist, because I haven't harmed you anyway. And still, if you think just because I'm a dark complexion, you think that I'm scary and I should not get employment in the university. That is. So I think colorism needs to be, and it has to be treated as at a very young age, because the kind of, even the proverbs that we have in Gujarati, we have kado kado chor. Any one person who is a thief or who is a antisocial or who is cruel is black, always, even in our proverbs. So I think all those we will have to change. Right from our nursery and preschool days, we will have to deal with colorism. It is as damaging as racism.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, before we move on with the vote of thanks, would you like to provide any concluding remarks on today's session?
My concluding remark is that these 5 presentations have really complemented each other, and all aspects of patriarchal control over women's sexuality, fertility, labor, and also the global and local, that we all need to think and act both locally as well as globally, because global thinking needs to have evidence-based feedback from local realities, which is extremely diverse, as Dr. Manisha Desai told us, or the question of violence, which is so universal. In whichever socio-cultural political context you see, sexual violence is used as a weapon to keep women in the permanent state and a perpetual state of humiliation, degradation, and humiliation. So I think we need to understand this, and also global solidarity, which I think all my previous speakers, they have emphasized. So these are the learnings. And I think tomorrow is also going to be a very interesting day where Dr. Soumya, Uma, and Dr. Vijayalakshmi, and our friend from Sweden, Linda Lane, they will be also explaining and deconstructing feminism from their own experiences and their positions. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, with this, we come to the end of day 2 of the Online International Winter School Program 2023, a 3-day immersive online certificate training course on feminism, fundamentals, facets, and future. I would like to hereby propose the formal vote of thanks on behalf of IMPRI Gender Impact Studies Center, GISC, New Delhi. We are really grateful to our experts for the day 2 of this online certificate training program, Dr. Vahida Nanar, Professor Manisha Desai, and Professor VIBHUTI Patel, and to Professor VIBHUTI Patel for chairing this session. We thank all of our participants who have raised such beautiful and pertinent questions and actively participating in this deliberation today. We look forward to welcoming you all on the 25th February at 6 p.m. for our last day of this training course, where we will be joined by Professor Soumya Uma, Professor Linda Lane, and Professor Vijayalakshmi Nanda. We are grateful if you're watching us later on YouTube or listening to us on our various podcasts or reading our publications. We hope you continue to join us in the future with our IMPRI Web Policy Talk and Web Policy Learnings. Wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Leena, you have been there from beginning till end, huh? I'm so happy.